So, Season 1 Reloaded. It's been a few days since release. I feel like the dust has finally settled, so let's talk about it. We are currently 2.5 months into this game. That's 10 weeks. And in those 10 weeks, we have had the Season 1 pre-season, Season 1 itself, and Season 1 Reloaded. And with that, we have had 4 acts worth of missions, 3 major boss fights, 2 Warlord strongholds, a new area being the Dark Ether with 2 tiers of difficulty, and all of that has been wrapped up into one open world experience where instead of progressing rounds, you complete contracts and other various activities to gain points and rewards to get stronger so you can fight in higher tiers, getting more points and better rewards, and so on, so on. And on paper, that sounds great. It sounds like a lot of stuff. In reality, it's kind of like biting into a sandwich, but it's just bread. There's no filling, there's no substance. And you might be thinking, besides, how is that possible? And well, let's start with those 3 boss fights. It's basically just one fight done 3 times. It's literally, that's all it is. You fight a worm 3 times over in 3 different locations. It's 3 different names and 3 different coats of paint. But at the end of the day, it's the same fight. It's the same boss. It's the same guy that does all the same attacks. It's nothing new. It's nothing fresh. It's the same thing 3 times. But the one thing I can't seem to wrap my head around is the fact that not many people seem to be frustrated or angry by this, or at least talking about it. Now, I understand fighting the same boss over and over again to get rewards. You know, I grew up playing Borderlands 2. I know exactly how that feels, spending months fighting the bunker just so I could get a 94% sham. But this isn't that. This is being given the same boss in 3 different instances to fight over and over again to get rewards. Now, I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, it's all due to a lack of effort, because let's be honest, out of all the studios that work on Call of Duty, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, Treyarch are probably the company that have put in the most effort, being jacked around all these different companies, being forced to work in games that aren't theirs yet again this year. So I understand why things may be a little lackluster at certain parts. But there is a big but. 90% of the reason could be resource based as to why things are a bit repetitive and they are using the same bosses and whatever over and over again. But that 10%, that tiny little 10% where it is effort related, could they have just gone, do you know what? Instead of making a worm, let's make it a mega abomination or an ultra abomination. I don't want them. I'm not sitting here going to be like, oh, I need them to make fully unique bosses for every encounter. No, not at all. But if it was a version of a mega abomination or a mangler or a mimic, it would just freshen it up a little bit, make it a little bit more interesting here and there, rather than just fighting another worm. Because if we have another 5 seasons worth of fighting worms, I'm going to be checking out hella soon. I mentioned in the intro of this video the legacy strongholds, the human enemy aspect of this game. Now, I'm not going to pretend like the human enemies of MWZ get me excited. I'm still not a fan of the convoys and those small little outposts and the merc strongholds, but after completing that first legacy stronghold, which I thought was good, you know, making your way up that hill, taking out the helicopter, working your way through the compound into the main building, where you then have to dodge all the traps before eventually fighting the boss. It was a good time, and it was a good challenge, especially from a solo perspective. And having all of this in mind, I did get a little excited when I learned we'd be having a second legacy stronghold. That wasn't until I experienced it. There are no excuses for how poorly designed this Duck Abbey fight is. I know I said I wouldn't blame a lack of effort to the lackluster content, but this is genuinely bottom of the barrel. Possibly one of the most pointless and worst boss fights, if you can even call it that I have played in a video game. The first stronghold required you to defeat those convoys or outposts I mentioned, as well as the strongholds, before you could actually get access to the actual boss fight. And yes, the new Warlord does require those as well. However, you can just skip all of that. If you have a Scorcher handy, or you can just use one of the zip lines on a building adjacent to the actual building the boss is on. And with that, you just head straight to the boss, and depending on your spawn, you can literally have this done within 3 to 5 minutes. Now, I would usually say this is a huge problem and it needs fixing, but it really doesn't, because the loot from this is just awful. And to make things even worse, the loot from this fight was actually labeled as the next premier spot for high tier loot, and they want a place to be competing for it. But there's literally no reason to fight over it, because all you get is a purple sniper and the possibility, not even the guarantee, the possibility of a Wunderwaffe that you'll lose at the end of the game anyway, as they don't give you the case, they just give you the gun. They have quite literally just dumped a bunch of enemies on the tallest building in the game and called it a day. No thought went into this, no planning, and no effort. If this is the content we are getting at the beginning of this game's life cycle, where it still has a large amount of people playing, a time where they should be prioritizing keeping those players around for as long as possible, God knows what we'll be getting during Season 4 and later, when most of the player base has moved on to other games whilst they wait for the next title. And it is even mentioning what this could have a knock-on effect to the next title if people see, this effort and go, well, why should I be playing this when they're clearly not focusing on this game mode? They're not focused on the next game mode, so I'm just not going to bother playing that. It could just snowball out of control, and I really hope that doesn't happen. That's probably a bit of a stretch, but you never know. You never know with this game. And I just touched on it briefly, but the loot is also something I want to talk about. I know this is one of the more frustrating things for people, as the loot really isn't that rewarding across the game. Even going back to those boss fights I mentioned earlier. Sure, beating those is how you unlock those high tier schematics, but the actual loot you get, the loot that drops from the bosses, for the most part is very underwhelming. If you're lucky, and I mean very lucky, you'll get something good, legendary ether tool, flawless crystal, or a wonder weapon case. But 90% of the time, you're going to be getting blue tools, raw crystals, just the absolute bottom tier trash, which makes doing those bosses even more redundant once you have those schematics. The same thing can be said about the loot in tier 3 and higher zones. Sometimes you'll get lucky, but most of the time you won't. And for some reason, about a month ago or so, a bunch of videos surfaced saying that the loot had been buffed, or loot was now incredibly good in these high tier zones, and so on. It's just not true. There are no reports from anyone in the community or patch notes that loot has been buffed. They just haven't adjusted it. For instance, this is a run I had sometime last week. 4 epic tools, 1 legendary tool, and 2 refined crystals. By far the best loot I've ever seen in a single run, and I posted on Twitter saying this is either the best run of my life or loot has been buffed, and from the responses, it was clearly just luck. So many people saying they hardly get good loot from high tier zones and contracts, which is why so many people are turning to tombstone glitches. And one last issue with loot whilst we're on the topic: stash space. Jesus Christ. This is the one thing I have been seeing everybody talk about since the launch, and we've all been saying the same thing. 10 spaces is not enough. Plain and simple. It hasn't been enough since day one, and it will never be enough. End of. I genuinely think all they need to do is increase stash space to about 30, and we'll all be happy. And I seriously don't understand this standoff behavior when it comes to increasing stash space. The opening few weeks of this game really have been a roller coaster of emotions. Some great highs and some terrible lows. I really want this game to succeed, as I believe it has all the minerals to be a top game mode. It just needs a little love. But before I go, I want to talk about this tweet. This was tweeted by the official Treyarch account, and it reads: Modern Warfare Zombies has been a blast. To celebrate, all players will receive a special gift after finishing a match between today and the start of Season 2. I want you to focus on the start of that. Modern Warfare Zombies has been a blast. It reads as if it's a goodbye. And I know this is probably some next level overthinking, but it does read like a goodbye. And honestly, It wouldn't surprise me. On 2 occasions in the last few installments of Zombies, Treyarch have pretty much just disappeared on us with very little to no communication. The first of these occasions was in the lead up to the final map for Cold War, being Forsaken. We were getting all the information for that particular season, everything going on in multiplayer and Warzone, but Zombies were silent. And it stayed like this for weeks. I don't think we actually got the first look at the map until about 2 or 3 days before release, and we didn't get a trailer until the day of the release. And Forsaken turned out to probably be the worst of the 4 Cold War maps, with it being ripped straight from the campaign. In the grand scheme of things, the map wasn't bad by any means, comfortable 6 out of 10 if you ask me, but, it wasn't great. And the other occasion was, of course, Vanguard. At least this time, we got a little communication. Sometime after Terra Maledicta, we got a statement saying they'd be focusing on something different for Vanguard Zombies, and then we didn't hear anything for 5 months, until one day, we got an announcement that none other than Shino Numa would be returning. And to be honest, the map was pretty good. So what I'm basically saying is don't be surprised if the content continues in this current direction, and one day Treyarch just says deuces. We'll see ya in the next one.